So I'm started in on making the tangs here, and you can use any flat strap for this that you want, but I generally just buy a piece of angle iron. And in this case, what I usually buy is I'm usually looking for 1/4 inch thick, and that's because I want the extra thickness, especially up here in the web, and gives me some extra material to work with for making the fences. So 1/4 inch angle iron works, or 1/4 inch thick angle iron, and 2 by 3 usually works really good. 3 for most English guns gives you more than enough material to get your tang cut in here. So 3 inches works good. If you're doing a longer tang, obviously you can get longer pieces of this, or you can do this out of flat strap. You can make this out of flat strap just as well. All you got to do is take a piece of flat that's wide enough and then heat it and bend it, of course. But just generic old angle iron works good for making a tang. And so what I did was I put it in my mill and cleaned it off. Just surface cleaned it, just ran a fly cutter across it and took all the scale off of it, both on the face and the top. Just makes a nice clean 90-degree edge instead of the rolled edge that the mill puts on it. And then I came in, did all my layouts, and used my mill to open this up and get it kind of close. And then from there, to get it to actually fit, I use a oil lamp, and I just smoke fit these with a little soot, and just takes a little time with files. Basically just got to get in there and clean everything up and open it up, and then on the back side you have to file in your angle to match the angles of your hooks. But if you do it right, take your time and fit it, it should go on there. Should be a nice tight fit, snug, shouldn't have any play in it, and should lock in nice and flush to the face. So not too big a deal, pretty easy to make it that far anyways. Next part of this to do is to get this flats cut in on each side, and then start shaping the fence, the scallop, and then ultimately I'll cut out the tang section. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll bend the tang, I'll heat it up and bend it to match the curve of the wrist. But if you're doing a pair of these like this, it's kind of nice to do it this way, and do your bend last, because that allows you to just flip it over and you'll be able to trace out the tang and whatnot on the other piece, and you'll have a matched set that you know is really close to being a good set. So that's what I'm going to work on now, is getting this other one machined up and fitted to this point, and then I'll start working on finishing up the breech cuts and nipples and all that, and get the fences in. One thing you do want to do when you make this is you do want to make it a little extra wide. I've got about 1/8 of an inch extra sticking over on each side here. That gives me a little extra material to bring my fences out a little farther and get the shape of the fence right. The other thing is the web back here, having that extra bit, allows me to run the fences in a little farther, get a nice curve to them, and not have to worry about material loss in there. So that helps. And then the last thing to think about on this is, because this is a 10 bore and it's 2 1/4 inches wide right here, or 2 1/2, I mean, sorry, it's 2 1/2 wide here. I'm actually going to taper this in just a little bit. On the back of these breeches, I'm going to radius them just a little bit in, and it'll narrow up the wrist section on this. And so ultimately, this extra material out here, other than the top where the fence is actually going to get cut off inside the breech width, and the breeches will get tapered down into it, radius down into it, and I'll do all that by hand fitting it. And that'll give me a narrower wrist section through here. So that's what I'm going to work on, is getting this other one basically to the same point that one is. So I put this back in my mill and came in with an end mill and cut these flats in here. And then while I had it all centered and everything, I went ahead and drilled for the nipple holes. And I got to thread these yet, but that's where they're centered at. And then once I had this all cut out, I was able to take my tang, put it on there, mark my edges, and use a rotary tool, die grinder, to come in and contour these out. And once I had them close, then I was able to clamp it up there, get it in position real tight, and tie the edges in real close and smooth on it. One of the things you'll notice on this, if I move this around here just a little bit, is that there's still a whole lot of excess material out here, and that I didn't carry this scallop for the fence all the way down to this outside edge. And the reason I didn't do that is because, like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to taper these off a little bit, and so I want to leave this material here so that when I taper it off, I can tie it in right to the edge of the taper. If I had to run this out straight out to the edge, when I tapered this off, my scallop would be offset and it wouldn't tie in properly. So I left this for now, and that covers the inside edge of the fence and gets the inside edge tied in real nice. The outside edge I'll tie in once I have this shaped out. So my next step is to go ahead and tap these, and then finish tying in the flash hole, because I do need to tie in a small flash hole from here into the patent chamber, and then it'll be ready to go. I'll be able to start moving on with shaping the rest of the tang and getting the rest side of the edge of the fences tapered and shaped out, and removing this bottom metal out here. So you can see I've got my fences cut here, and or the inside of them anyways, and I drilled and tapped for my nipples, and I also drilled the flash channel into the recessed chamber on this. So now I'm going to start doing the layout for the top cuts on the tang and getting it shaped down. So I did some basic layout here to give it the shape of a English tang, and then I just took a hacksaw and hacksawed down kind of close to the line, and I used files to finish up the shape. And then what I'll obviously have to do is I'll have to come in and hand file the fences, trim the edges, and shape the scallop in here yet. And then this one I can use as a pattern to make the other one, since they're both the same. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll be able to bend this tang down and get it close to the radius of the wrist. So that's where I'm at on this so far, is a whole lot of shaping to do yet. The scallop, the fences, and get the edges trimmed in. So I'll keep working on it. So I've got my tang all fitted up here and trimmed out. The next step is, in order to start working on these fences and shaping this out, I've got to know where my locks are going to fit on the sides here, to tell me how much material I can take off, how my lock's going to inset, and where my fences are going to come out. And so I need to figure out exactly where my locks are going to be in relation to this. Now there's basically two correct ways to do this historically. And it really depends on the size of the rifle you're building. On a big bore like this, there's two options. On a small bore, there's really only one style that's historically correct. And I'm going to move the camera here and I'll show you the difference. Okay, so looking at this from the side, you can see when I set my lock up here and I get it kind of close to flush with the outside edge, there's a big gap right here. And of course this will be back just a little bit because that's where the fence sits, or the tang edge comes down. You can see there's a big gap that runs along here. Basically the two ways to fill in this gap, really determined by the size of your barrel and your gun. On most English guns in normal calibers, what you'll see what's called a drip bar that fills in this space here, and that's usually when you make the breech plug, you leave extra material on each breech plug, you hand file it and fit it, and then you solder a piece onto the barrel and hand file it and fit it so that it looks like it's all one piece, and that bar is what fills in the gap and makes your lock flush to the outside edge. On a big bore though, where you've got more barrel diameter and more radius underneath, you can actually get away with tucking the locks underneath. And I'm going to move the camera again and I'll show you from the other side, because I've already modified one lock to fit the way I'm going to do this one. So this is the lock I was just showing you, and this is a lock that I've modified. If you don't want to do this with a drip bar, on a big bore, historically you can see that these were done a different way. And what they did on big bores was they made this section of the lock a little taller. And that's what I've done here, is I took a standard lock and used my TIG welder to add a little extra metal up here. You can see there's a little extra metal there. And when I put it together this way, you'll notice that I radiused this inside off and brought it up to, instead of being flat, it's now up to almost a knife edge. It's got just a little flat on the surface so that it's not sharp, but it's radiused off to match the contour of the barrel. And what that allows me to do is, that way I don't need a drip bar to fill in the gap. I can tuck the lock underneath and it fits nice and tight along this edge with no gap in it. And it allows me to shift the lock, instead of being out flush to the edge out here, it allows me to shift the lock to the inside just a little ways, maybe 3/32 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch. It'll allow me to shift that lock in just a little bit, which will narrow up the wrist section on this gun. Instead of having a full width here and then having to taper off behind the locks to get the wrist down to a nice size, this allows me to shift the locks to the inside and start with a little narrower wrist, and so I won't have such a massive transition at the back of the locks. But it gives a nice tight fit this way, closes up that seam, and you don't have to use a drip bar. And this was done on basically only big bore guns were done this way. Usually on smaller bore rifles you'll almost always see a drip bar on them. That was classic on a smaller bore. On big bores though, where you've got that extra gap in the radius, it was done this way sometimes to keep a narrower wrist this way. So either one is historically correct, and this gun certainly could have been done with a drip bar, but in order to keep it slimmer and a nicer looking package and get the transitions to look a little cleaner, I went ahead and modified the lock, and I'll do that with all the other locks so that they fit nice and snug underneath the radius like that with no drip bar. That'll allow me to transition this off and bring my fences out to the edge and give a transition down here, and it'll give a nice transition where it goes into the wrist. So a little different way to do it, but certainly it's historically correct and accurate on big bore guns to do it this way. Seen plenty of them that are like this. I've also seen plenty that were full width and had a drip bar in there. So either way is correct. You can do it whichever way suits you the best, or whichever way the equipment you have that'll make it easiest on you. Like I said, I have a TIG, so it's not too big a deal for me to build up metal on these locks and shape them out. Before I had a TIG though, I used to do oxyacetylene welding, and I could just as easily put a piece on there with an oxyacetylene torch. So works out the same either way though. But this will allow me to figure out where my lock's going to sit. It'll tell me how much edge I can take off of here, and that'll establish how much I can take off of the tang, and then I can start shaping my fences.